I know who Jeffrey Dahmer is. Of course I know who Jeffrey Dahmer is. I know what he's done. I know what he's known for. I thought I knew the story, but guys, the amount of times that I had to step away from my computer because I actually could not. It's shocking to me that a human being can be responsible for the things that I'm about to tell you. That being said, this is not for everyone. It's gruesome, it's disgusting, it's evil, and it's hard to listen to. So if you don't want to, or if you don't think it'll be good for your mental health, please scroll. Jeffrey Dahmer took the lives of 17 men and boys throughout the years of 1978 to 1971. Let's get into it, I guess, because after this, I never want to hear his name again. I'm also not going to be naming the victims out of respect for the families. I think some of them have made it known that they don't want the names out there, so I'm not saying names. Jeffrey Dahmer was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. How you would describe his family and the way that he grew up is up for debate. It kind of depends on who you ask. Jeffrey himself remembers his house being full of tension. The house was always thick in there. His father was not around very often because he was focusing on his studies, and his mother was fighting a long, difficult battle with her mental health. She struggled with depression and she craved attention from her husband but never got it, which left her very lonely and sad, and she would spend most of her days in bed. As a toddler, Jeffrey was described as happy and energetic, but he went through a surgery when he was around 4 years old. It seems like after that surgery, his personality changed. He became very timid, very quiet, and his teachers noticed that it seemed like he was very lonely. The absence of his father and the struggles of his mother seemed to have a pretty big impact on him. In 1966, the family moved to Doylestown, Ohio, where the mother would give birth to her second son, Jeffrey's brother. A couple years later, in May of 1968, they moved again to Bath Township in Ohio. From a very early age, Jeffrey had an interest in what was inside of them. So Jeffrey liked to collect them from the side of the road, or I guess from wherever he could find them. He would dissect them to see what was inside. He specifically was fascinated with bones. He would take them out, clean them up, and keep them stored in a shed in his yard. Neon red flag. When Jeffrey was around 10 years old, they were having a family dinner where they were eating chicken, and he looked at his father and asked him what would happen to the chicken bones if they were placed in bleach. His father took that to be scientific curiosity, and he showed him exactly how to bleach, clean, and preserve bones. In 1977, when Jeffrey was in his early teen years, he became really disconnected with society. He carried around a really tense, cold energy, and he started having really dark thoughts and feelings, and he was craving and wanting to do terrible things to people, especially to boys and men. This was also around the time when Jeffrey realized that he was attracted to men, but he never told anyone. A couple years later, his parents get divorced, and it seems like that was a turning point for Jeffrey to turn his scary thoughts into actions. In May of 1978, he graduates high school. His father moves out of the family home because they got divorced, and his mom decided that she was going to move out as well, and she was going to take Jeffrey's little brother with her. They went to go live with a family member, leaving Jeffrey all alone in this house. Jeffrey Dahmer was left with this house all to himself, and 3 weeks after graduating high school, he would commit his first murder. June 18th, 1978, Jeffrey was driving around when he saw an 18-year-old hitchhiker. He rolled down the window to talk to him, and he asked him if he wanted to come back with him to his parents' house to hang out, have a good night together. He was flirting with him, I think, a little bit. He agreed. They go back to Jeffrey's house. They hang out. They're having fun, listening to music. When the boy says, "Okay, this was fun. Thanks so much. I'm gonna leave now." And Jeffrey says, "No, you're not." Jeffrey was upset because he did not want him to leave, so to stop him from being able to leave, he grabbed a 10-pound dumbbell, struck the boy with it twice in the back of the head, leaving him unconscious. He then grabbed a barbell and strangled the boy until he was no longer alive. He proceeded to remove the clothing from the boy's body. He stood over him, looking at him, and at that moment, Jeffrey was feeling very excited. He was happy about what he just did. He then dragged the boy's body into the basement. The next day, to get rid of the body, Jeffrey cut it apart like it was a science project. He buried the human remains in his backyard. Several weeks later, he would go back to the remains, grab them, to strip the bones clean and dissolve everything that was not bones with acid. He then flushed the acid mixture and solution down the toilet. He crushed the bones with a sledgehammer and scattered them around in the woods behind his house. 6 weeks passed. Jeffrey's father is now engaged to a new lady, and they stopped by the family home to check on Jeffrey, which was the first time they discovered that Jeffrey had been left alone and he was living alone. The dad tells Jeffrey, you should probably go to college, don't you think? And Jeffrey says, sure, I guess. That August, he enrolled in Ohio State University. Jeffrey quickly realized that school was not for him. He had absolutely no interest in being there, so he dropped out after only attending for 3 months. January 1979, Jeffrey is around 18 years old, and his father says, well, if you're not going to go to school, how about you go to the army? And he enrolls. By July of 1979, he was deployed to West Germany, where he served as a medic. He was not in the army for long, but during the time that he was, we later later find out, like years later, 2 soldiers end up coming forward and saying that Jeffrey SA'd them the entire time that they were deployed together. In March of 1981, Jeffrey was seen unsuitable for service and was discharged from the army. After that, Jeffrey was scared to go home and face his father, so he decided that he was going to go to Miami Beach and try to live by himself there. In Miami, he plans to live at a motel, but he fails to pay rent. He gets evicted. He moves back to Ohio, where his dad agrees to let him live with him as well as his stepmom. 2 weeks into living with them, Jeffrey was arrested for and disorderly conduct. His father had enough of him. It just seemed like Jeffrey couldn't or wouldn't behave, so his father kicked him out and he went to go live with his grandmother. While living with his grandma, he went to church, he got a job, but he did not stay out of trouble for long. By late 1985, Jeffrey is now around 24 to 25 years old. He started regularly visiting bathhouses. He thought that it was a really relaxing place for him, and he started having physical relationships with some of the male staff there. But those relationships were not meeting his needs, because Jeffrey realized that he did not like when his partners moved during whatever they were doing. He later says, quote, "I trained myself to view people as objects of pleasure instead of as people," end quote. On November 20th, 1987, Jeffrey is now around 27 years old. He meets a man while he's out and he invites him to come back with him to his hotel room. The man agrees. The following morning, Jeffrey Dahmer wakes up and he sees the man lying with his chest crushed in and black and blue bruises all over him. He was no longer alive. Jeffrey later said he had no intentions of ending his life and he did not know how it happened. To dispose of the body, Jeffrey bought a suitcase to put his body in. A week later, he took it back to the house that he was living at with his grandma. Over the course of the next 2 hours, Jeffrey took his time cutting it up, ripping everything off of the bones, disposed of the flesh in trash bags, and he crushed the bones with a sledgehammer. For 2 weeks, Jeffrey kept the head, only the head, wrapped in a blanket, and when he finally decided to get rid of it, he boiled it with something, I don't even know what, to get rid of everything that was not bone. And after that, he tried to use the bleaching method that his father had taught him to preserve the skull, which he kept for his own pleasure until it was too brittle and he had to get rid of it. Jeffrey would later say that after that murder, his obsession with killing men went into full swing and that he did not even try to stop it. He began actively seeking victims primarily at gay bars. He would meet them, he would ask them to come back to his place with him where he would them until they were unconscious, SA them, kill them, and then dispose of the bodies. Jeffrey did that to 2 more victims while still living at his grandma's house. She forced him to move out in 1988, not because she knew anything about his crimes, but because she was tired of his behavior and tired of him bringing boys into her house in late hours of the night. She also often complained about foul smells coming from her basement. In September of 1989, Jeffrey was around 29 years old. He was now living in his own apartment. He lured a 13-year-old boy back to his apartment. His actions towards that boy resulted in SA charges against Jeffrey, which he pleaded guilty to, claiming that he thought the boy was much older. While waiting for his trial, he found another victim. This victim he lured, SA'd, strangled, photographed, and disposed of the body. And from that victim, Jeffrey kept body parts and bones to preserve them. He later said that this was because he found him so beautiful and he did not want to lose him. His trial was in May of 1989. He was sentenced to 1 year in prison with day release, meaning that he could go out during the day. He just had to be back in prison at night. He was granted early release after only serving 10 months of his sentence. Throughout the next 2 years, Jeffrey would murder 12 more victims, making his total victim count of 17 boys and men. His first victim, after leaving prison, he lured into his apartment and he did to him what he had done to the others. This time, he took a lot of photographs during the process. He did the same thing to his next victim, but while trying to preserve and dry out the skull for him to keep, he put it in the oven and it exploded, ruining it. Jeffrey later referred to this murder as a complete waste because he was unable to keep anything from it. With different victims, Jeffrey would experiment different things, such as experimenting with different chemicals and acids to dispose of the bodies. He often consumed the flesh of said bodies, and even tried to do some science experiments while some of his victims were still alive, attempting to inject stuff in their brains. May 27th of 1991, Jeffrey is 31 years old at this point. His neighbor calls the police to report a naked running down the street who was one of Jeffrey's victims. When the police showed up, the boy was completely out of it. He didn't even know what was going on because of stuff that Jeffrey had given him. Jeffrey told police officers that that boy was his 19-year-old boyfriend when in reality it was his victim and he was 14 years old. Jeffrey also had no idea about this, but the boy was also the younger brother of one of his earlier victims. The police believed Jeffrey and they escorted the boy and Jeffrey back to his apartment. They peeked inside the apartment but didn't really take a look at it. They just told Jeffrey to, quote, take care of the boy, and they left. Had the police searched his apartment then, they would have found the dead body of another one of his victims, but they didn't. As soon as police left, Jeffrey took the life of that 14-year-old boy. After that, Jeffrey killed 4 more people before he was ultimately arrested and caught. With one of his last victims, Jeffrey kept the head and the heart in his fridge and the bones in his freezer. On July 22nd of 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer was finally arrested. One of his victims was able to punch him in the face and run out of his apartment. He found 2 police officers that were outside and he was able to flag them down. The victim, who had just ran out of Jeffrey's apartment, still had handcuffs on him, and when he spoke to police, he agreed to walk them to the apartment where this had all happened. They go back up to the apartment. Jeffrey answers the door. He lets the victim and the 2 officers into his apartment, and the officers start walking around taking a look. One of the officers looks into the bedroom. He sees that a drawer is open, and when he looked inside of it, he found a stack of Polaroid pictures. Many of them, which were actually all of them, were violent, gruesome photos of human bodies, and he looked at the pictures, looked at the background in the pictures, looked up at the apartment he was standing in, realized that the pictures were taken into the apartment, and he was gonna go show the other officer. He walks into the living room with the photos to show the officer, and he quietly says to him, "These are real." When Jeffrey realized what they were looking at, he tried to struggle with the officers and was resisting arrest. The officers were able to put him in handcuffs and they called for backup. When Jeffrey was lying on the floor with his handcuffs, one of the officers opened the fridge to find it stuffed with human parts, and Jeffrey looked up at the officer and said, quote, "For what I did, I should be dead." The search of his apartment revealed a human head in the fridge, 3 more in the freezer, so many other disgusting things that I can't even say because I will throw up, as well as an extensive gallery of Polaroid pictures of his victims and his crimes. Jeffrey Dahmer later said that he planned to build a private altar with his victims' body parts, and he said that that altar would be a place where he could feel at home. His trial began January 30th of 1992. He was charged with 15 counts of first-degree murder. Jeffrey initially pled not guilty to all the charges, even though he had confessed prior during his police questioning. He eventually changed his plea to guilty by reason of insanity. His defense team brought up all the gruesome details of all of his disgusting crimes, and they tried to use that as proof, claiming that only someone who was insane would be able to commit such terrible crimes. Jeffrey was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in prison, with a 16th term later added on. Jeffrey Dahmer was killed on November 28th, 1994 by a fellow inmate. When the inmate killed him, he said, quote, "God told me to do it. Jeffrey Dahmer is dead." I didn't even say so many of the details and the things that he did, frankly, because the video would be 3 hours long, but also because I can't even justify saying things like that out of my mouth. Like, I know I speak about some vile things, but this man is straight evil. It's unbelievable. I think I've said this in one of my videos before, but it really does not make sense to me how a person like myself or you have a human brain and we function normally, kind of, but like we're normal people, and then you have people like Jeffrey Dahmer that have the same organs as we do. They have a brain, they have a heart, but then they still do things like this. Like, it's literally beyond me. I don't understand it. Anyway, let me know what you think, because I am baffled, and after this video I never want to think of Jeffrey Dahmer ever again. Thank you for spending time with me today. I hope you've had the best day ever. If not, go do something that makes you happy. Turn the day around. I love you so much. Massive kiss on the forehead to every single one of you.